All right, today we're digging into a really fascinating murder case from back in 1957. The evidence was overwhelming, the killer was caught, but the entire thing, a man's life, ended up hanging on a single, tiny clerical error.
So let's get into it. This is a story about a brutal murder, one that grew out of a bitter family feud. It really seemed like a total slam dunk for the prosecution, but a single legal loophole threatened to unravel everything. So to really get what happened here, we've got to go back and look at a family that was just being torn apart by conflict.
Now, this wasn't some random act of violence. Not at all. It was really the final, bloody chapter in this awful family dispute over land and money. Tensions had been simmering for months, boiling over from failed legal meetings into these open, hostile fights. The attack itself was just brutal, and it was coordinated. As Buggeral was walking from his village, he was ambushed, and while other people held him down, his own brother, Narayan Rao, stabbed him multiple times in the neck and abdomen.
So for the police, this whole thing seemed pretty straightforward. Let's take a look at the evidence they brought to court.
The prosecution's case was really built on two crucial eyewitnesses. First, you had the victim's own uncle, who saw most of the attack happen, and second, a 12-year-old boy who had a clear, totally unobstructed view of the murder from just a few yards away.
And it wasn't just what people said. They had some seriously damning physical proof. The police found blood-stained clothes in the accused's homes, and the murder weapon itself, a knife that belonged to Narayan Rao, found right near the body. And yep, lab tests confirmed it was all human blood.
You would think so, wouldn't you? Narayan Rao was convicted of murder, sentenced to death. But this is exactly where the story takes a sharp turn, away from the crime scene and straight into the courtroom. The defense, they found a mistake. Not in the evidence, nothing to do with the murder itself, but in the police procedure leading up to the trial. Okay, so there's this specific rule, Section 173.4, and it's absolutely fundamental to a fair trial. It basically says the police have to give the defense copies of everything, the police report, witness statements, all of it, so they can actually prepare their case. But for whatever reason, in this case, the police and the magistrate, they just didn't do it. They completely failed to provide these critical documents before the trial started. And that one little oversight, that became the defense's entire strategy. This single mistake became the central issue of the whole case, taking it all the way up to the Supreme Court. The whole thing came down to this one legal distinction. The defense claimed the error was a fatal illegality. They argued a mandatory rule was broken, so the whole trial should just be thrown out. The state fought back, saying, no, it was just a minor irregularity, a slip-up that could be fixed as long as it didn't actually hurt the defendant's case. So the Supreme Court had to make this huge decision, one that would really define the difference between a simple procedural mistake and a genuine miscarriage of justice. The court's entire interpretation hinged on one little word, shall. The law said the police shall provide the documents. The court decided that in this legal context, shall wasn't an absolute unbreakable command. It was directory, meaning more like a strong suggestion, not mandatory, a rule that could never, ever be broken.
Yeah, the court basically said the police's mistake was a directory error, an irregularity. It was like messing up the oven temperature a little bit. Sure, it wasn't a perfect procedure, but you still ended up with a valid trial. It wasn't like forgetting the flour, which would have been a mandatory error, an illegality, which would mean you don't have a trial at all. But okay, so how did the court decide if this irregularity actually mattered? Well, they used a simple but really powerful test.
The court's logic came down to something called the prejudice test. A procedural mistake only matters if it causes actual harm or prejudice to the defense. And when they looked at the facts, they found zero prejudice. The defense did eventually get the documents, they never asked for more time to prepare, and they got to fully cross-examine every single witness. In the end, the defense couldn't point to a single specific way they were handicapped by the delay. So that procedural error, it had zero real-world impact on how fair the trial was. And so, in the end, the evidence of the crime was just too strong to be undone by a clerical error that caused no real harm. Justice, the court decided, is about substance, not just about having perfect procedure. And that leaves us with a question that courts are still grappling with today. Where do you draw the line between following the absolute letter of the law and achieving true justice? Thanks for joining this explainer.